All right, so let's dive into this whole U.S.-Ukraine situation. It's a real mess, right?
Yeah, it's definitely gotten complicated.
This deal falling apart, I mean, billions in aid, access to all those minerals Ukraine has, it all blew up because of security guarantees.
It seems that way, yeah.
It really makes you wonder, what does the U.S. actually want out of this? And how far will Zelenskyy go? I mean, he's got to be feeling the pressure.
Absolutely. He's in a tough spot. Security is understandably his top priority. He needs assurances.
Yeah.
Wants to know the West has his back.
It's like he's asking for insurance against Putin, basically.
It's a good analogy.
Right.
A very expensive insurance policy.
And this whole thing with him refusing to sign, not just once, but twice, it was like watching a slow-motion train wreck.
It was definitely a power move on his part. Refusing to sign with Bessent in Kiev, then again with Vance and Rubio. He's making a point.
So he's playing hardball. Okay, I get that. But why blow it up in the Oval Office? With the cameras rolling, what was he thinking?
Well, I think that's the key here. It was public. He broke with all the normal diplomatic rules. Bessent even said Zelenskyy messed up the whole peace process by doing that.
You're right. Bessent was furious, called it one of the greatest diplomatic mishaps of all time, did he not? It's got to sting when the Treasury Secretary says that about you. And then you've got Trump on Truth Social calling Zelenskyy not ready for peace. It's a mess.
Zelensky's on X, though, thanking the U.S. and talking about a just and lasting peace. It's a PR battle, for sure.
And poor Bessent's caught in the middle. He called it an own goal for Zelenskyy. Like, he sabotaged himself. You can really sense his frustration.
Yeah, you can tell they thought they had this deal in the bag. They see it as this essential step to stabilizing Ukraine, getting a peace deal with Russia, and Zelenskyy just, well, he threw a wrench in the works.
But wait, there's another side to this. Senator Klobuchar met with Zelenskyy right before, and she said he was in great spirits, ready to sign. What's going on here? Did he change his mind at the last second?
It's a good question. Maybe it was a calculated move to force their hand on security guarantees? With everyone watching, he had leverage.
So he called their bluff on the whole long-term security shield thing.
It's a possibility. But let's not forget about the EU. Bessent said they were supposed to provide those guarantees, not NATO.
Hold on, the EU, not NATO. Why the distinction? Doesn't that seem strange?
Well, the U.S. probably wants to avoid a direct conflict with Russia. Pushing the EU forward lets them kind of stay back a bit.
Isn't that a cop-out, though? I mean, Starmer, the British PM, said any real guarantee needs the U.S. to back it up. They all want someone else to take the lead.
Yeah, that's a problem. The U.S. wants to help Ukraine, but doesn't want to provoke Russia, and Europe isn't going to jump in without the U.S. It puts Ukraine in a tough spot.
It's a mess. So what's the bottom line? We have a failed deal, confusion about these security guarantees, and a diplomatic train wreck. Where does that leave Zelenskyy?
Well, he's saying Ukraine will sign the mineral deal, but only as a first step. He's still holding out for those guarantees.
Even after all this. Wow.
He knows that without protection, any economic deal means nothing if Russia invades again.
He's definitely not making friends here. I mean, Representative Kerner called his actions inappropriate, and Senator Schmidt said he's been difficult for weeks.
There are definitely people in the U.S. government who think he should have just taken the deal and worked on the guarantees later. They see him as being too confrontational.
But in his ex-post, he doubled down, thanking the U.S. and saying Ukraine's committed to a just and lasting peace. He's not backing down.
It's a balancing act. He needs U.S. support, but he has to show he's not going to compromise on security. It's a tough spot to be in.
All right, we've got the players, the timeline, the different viewpoints, but what does it all mean for the U.S. and Ukraine going forward?
That's the big question, isn't it? And that's what we'll explore in the next part of this deep dive.
Don't go anywhere because there's a lot more to unpack. It's easy to get caught up in all the back and forth, but, it's important to remember the bigger picture here.
Yeah, I agree. It's not just about this one deal or even just about Zelenskyy and Trump. It goes deeper than that. There are real tensions here.
What kind of tensions? I mean, it's not just about the impeachment thing from a few years ago, right? That's got to be old news by now.
Well, it certainly didn't help. I mean, that whole situation definitely created some mistrust, right? Trump trying to pressure Zelenskyy, that's hard to forget.
So even before this whole mineral deal came up, Zelenskyy had reasons to doubt the U.S., to be unsure if they really had his back.
Right. And then you add in the war. I mean, let's be real. Ukraine is fighting for its survival here. They're up against Russia, and Zelenskyy needs to know he can count on the U.S.
It's hard to focus on long-term economic deals when you're worried about being invaded, for sure.
Absolutely. For Zelenskyy, those minerals don't mean much without security guarantees. Like, what's the point if you can't protect what you have?
He's in a tough position. He needs U.S. support, but he also doesn't want to be used, right? Like a pawn in some big power game.
He's walking a tightrope, that's for sure. He wanted the deal, but only as a first step. He needed those security guarantees, which brings us back to the Oval Office.
Yeah. Was that a mistake? Pushing so hard, so publicly. It seems like it backfired.
It's hard to say. Maybe he overplayed his hand, made some enemies, risked the whole deal.
That's what Bessent and some of those Republicans are saying.
Yeah. But maybe, just maybe, he felt like he had to do it to show he was serious. Putin respects strength, right? Maybe that was the message he was sending.
So it was a gamble, calling their bluff on the whole security shield thing.
It's possible. He might have thought it was worth the risk. But don't forget, there's another player here. The EU, Bessent said they were supposed to be the ones providing those guarantees.
The EU, not NATO, but why?
Because the U.S. doesn't want to get dragged into a war with Russia. They want to help it from a distance. The EU is like a buffer.
Doesn't that just create confusion, though? I mean, Starmer said any real guarantee needs the U.S. to back it up. Everyone's passing the buck?
Yeah, that's a problem. The U.S. wants to help, but not too much. And Europe won't do anything without the U.S. Ukraine is stuck in the middle.
So we have this failed deal, no clear answers on security, and a diplomatic mess. What does this mean for Ukraine?
Well, Zelensky says he'll sign the mineral deal, but only as a starting point. He still wants those guarantees.
He's not giving up, even now.
He knows that without protection, any economic gains could be gone in an instant if Russia attacks again.
He's definitely not making things easy for himself. Turner called him inappropriate, and Schmidt said he's been difficult.
Yeah, some in the U.S. government are not happy. They think he should have taken the deal and worried about the guarantees later.
But in his post, he thanked the U.S. and talked about just and lasting peace. He's sticking to his guns.
He needs to. He needs the U.S., but he also has to protect Ukraine. It's a tough balancing act.
We've talked about the U.S., Ukraine, but what about the other big player? The one who could change everything?
You mean Russia? Putin?
Exactly. What he does next is the real wild card here. Nothing else matters if he decides to invade again.
That's the uncertainty hanging over everything. We can analyze all we want, but ultimately Putin's the one calling the shots.
So we have the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia, all with different goals, different ideas. It's complicated.
And that's why this situation is so important. It shows how messy geopolitics can be. You have all these competing interests, the risk of conflict. It's a lot to unpack.
And in the middle of it all are the people of Ukraine. It's easy to forget that real lives are at stake here.
It's important to remember that. While we're talking about strategy and diplomacy, there are millions of people whose lives have been turned upside down by this war.
Absolutely. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, but we still need to talk about the potential consequences of all this. What are the possible scenarios? Where do we go from here?
Well, there's a chance, maybe a slim one, that the U.S. and Ukraine can work things out.
But how? There's been so much damage, so much public fighting. Can they really come back from that?
It would be tough. Both sides would need to give a little. Zelensky would need to compromise, maybe take things slower, and the U.S. would need to be more serious about security guarantees.
So it's not impossible, but it'll be a long road. What if they can't fix it? Could the U.S. actually pull back its support?
It's a scary thought, but it's possible. If the U.S. thinks Zelensky is unreliable, they might not want to help as much. Less money, fewer weapons, less diplomacy.
Leaving Ukraine to fight Russia alone.
It would be a disaster for Ukraine. It would embolden Putin and make the war last even longer.
And then there's Putin. Like you said, he's the wild card. He could change everything, no matter what the U.S. and Ukraine do.
Exactly. We can't predict what he'll do, and that's what makes this whole situation so dangerous.
So lots of possibilities, from patching things up to things getting even worse, and Putin is the big unknown.
That's the nature of geopolitics. It's unpredictable, and the stakes are incredibly high. That's why it's so important to pay attention, to think critically, to try to understand all sides of the story.
That's a great point. This deep dive has really shown how complex this whole situation is. There's no easy answers.
And that's true for a lot of the challenges we face today. We need to be informed and engaged.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about what could happen next. We've seen the diplomatic breakdown, but what are the consequences?
Well, one possibility is that the U.S. and Ukraine try to smooth things over and maybe come to some sort of agreement.
But is that realistic? I mean, it's been so public, so bitter. Can they really rebuild that trust?
It would be tough, no question. Both sides would have to admit they made mistakes, be willing to compromise, Zelenskyy would need to show he's flexible, maybe take a step-by-step approach, and the U.S. would have to get serious about those security guarantees.
So it's possible, but a long shot. What if it doesn't happen? Could the U.S. actually reduce its support for Ukraine?
It's a real concern. If the U.S. starts to see Zelenskyy as a liability, they might be less willing to help. Maybe they cut back on financial aid, hold back on weapons, or just aren't as active in trying to find a diplomatic solution.
Basically leaving Ukraine to fight Russia alone.
Pretty much. And that would be devastating for Ukraine. It would probably make the war drag on even longer, and who knows how many more people would suffer.
And we can't forget about Putin. He could decide to do something that changes everything, no matter what happens between the U.S. and Ukraine.
That's the unpredictable factor here. He's shown he's willing to use force, and we just don't know what he'll do next.
So lots of possibilities, good and bad, and Putin's the big question mark. It's a lot to think about.
And that's why this whole situation is so fascinating and so worrying. It shows how complicated things are in the world today. There are no easy answers, and the consequences are huge.
And while we're talking about all this, it's easy to forget that there are real people in Ukraine whose lives are being affected by all of this.
Yeah, it's important to remember that. We're analyzing and debating, but there are millions of people dealing with the consequences of this war every day.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot, but we still need to think about what happens next. What are the potential consequences of this whole mess?
Well, one possibility is that the U.S. and Ukraine manage to patch things up and maybe reach some kind of agreement.
Is that even possible now, after everything that's happened?
It would be tough. Both sides would have to put aside their anger and be willing to compromise. Zelenskyy would need to be more flexible, and the U.S. would have to give him more concrete assurances about security.
So it's a long shot. What if they can't make it work? Could this lead to the U.S. reducing its support for Ukraine?
That's a real possibility. If the U.S. sees Zelenskyy as unreliable or too difficult to work with, they might not want to help as much. They could cut back on financial aid, send fewer weapons, or just be less involved in trying to find a diplomatic solution.
So basically leaving Ukraine to face Russia on its own.
That's the worst-case scenario. And it would be a huge setback for Ukraine. It would likely mean more fighting, more suffering, and no end in sight for the war.
And we can't forget about Putin. He could change everything with one decision.
Exactly. That's the wild card here. We have no way of knowing what he's planning, and that makes this whole situation incredibly dangerous.
So many possibilities and so much uncertainty. It's a lot to process.
And it highlights something really important. The world is a complicated place. There are no easy solutions, and even the best intentions can lead to unintended consequences.
That's for sure. This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how complex this situation is. It's made me realize there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider.
That's the key. Stay informed, stay curious, and never stop asking questions.
Great advice. We'll be back for the final part of this deep dive to discuss what could happen next and explore some possible ways forward. You know, we've been focused on the politics, the deal, all the back and forth, but I keep thinking about the people in Ukraine. They're the ones really living this.
It's true. It's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff. But this war has real human cost. People have lost their homes, their families. Their lives have been turned upside down.
And even if the fighting stopped tomorrow, those scars would take a long time to heal.
Absolutely. Rebuilding a country after something like this, it's not just about buildings and roads. It's about trauma, about rebuilding trust, about coming to terms with what happened. That takes time, generations even.
So, looking ahead, where do we go from here? What are the possible scenarios after this whole mess?
Well, I guess one possibility is that the U.S. and Ukraine try to fix things, find a way to move forward.
But can they? After all that's been said, all the anger, it feels like something's broken.
It would be tough. They'd both need to be willing to back down a little. Maybe Zelenskyy agrees to a slower approach, and the U.S. gets serious about those security guarantees.
It sounds like a long shot. What if they can't fix it? Could this actually lead to less U.S. support for Ukraine?
It's definitely a worry. If the U.S. sees Zelenskyy as someone they can't work with, they might not want to help as much. Less money, maybe fewer weapons, less effort on the diplomatic front.
So Ukraine would be more on its own against Russia.
It would make things much harder for them. They'd be facing a powerful enemy with less help from their most important ally. It could mean the war drags on, more people get hurt, and the situation just gets worse.
And then there's Putin. We keep coming back to him. No matter what the U.S. and Ukraine do, he could change everything in an instant.
He's the big unknown. We can analyze and speculate all we want, but we just don't know what he'll do. That's what makes this whole situation so unpredictable and so dangerous.
So we've got this range of possibilities from trying to patch things up to things getting even worse. And Putin could just throw a wrench into everything.
That's the reality of geopolitics, unfortunately. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and the stakes are incredibly high.
This deep dive has really underlined that, I think. There's no easy answers here.
Exactly. And that's something we need to remember when we think about not just this conflict, but all the challenges facing the world today. We need to be informed, we need to engage in critical thinking, and we need to be willing to consider different perspectives.
It's a lot to take in, but it's important. It's about understanding the world around us, the forces at play, and the impact these events have on real people's lives.
And it's about remembering that even in the midst of conflict, even when things seem hopeless, there's always a possibility for dialogue, for finding common ground, for building a better future.
It's a message of hope, really, that even in the darkest of times, we can still strive for peace, for understanding, for a world where conflicts are resolved through words, not weapons. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, explored some complex issues, and hopefully challenged you to think critically about the world around us.